Okay, thank you very much, Tendai, for this opportunity to discuss with the engineers. And thank you, Engineer Manuhwa, for finding time to discuss with us on various issues affecting or pertaining to the engineering issues, infrastructure issues in our country, and trying to see what is the way forward and how things can be improved, hoping that our discussions will obviously get into the right ears. I will be using voice notes for much of the part, and I hope it is okay for the group to do so. Engineer Manuhwa, I've read your profile. We have not met before, but congratulations, you have actually built a prolific CV, and you were involved in the development in Zimbabwe and in the region. So welcome to this platform. So to open up the discussion, Engineer Manuhwa or Engineer Martin, I'll probably start calling you Engineer Martin from now on. To open up the discussion, maybe if you don't mind just giving us your brief overview or assessment of the level of infrastructure in Zimbabwe in particular, in terms of where we are now and where we would like to be, where we are going. We understand that Zimbabwe is currently in a heavy infrastructure activity program, where on the most part we are restoring infrastructure to where it was before. And but your opinion, say, on where we are going and where we'd like to be. Certain projects are restoration projects in terms of bringing back what was destroyed or what had gone down. Other projects, they are new projects, modernization projects, if ever we are going there, or we have started doing those kind of projects that involve even modernization to that stage. Maybe you can give us a highlight or your opinion on where we are and what we are trying to achieve in Zimbabwe. Thank you, Engineer, for that opening. Talking about the funding of the infrastructure and all the money that we need, we see that currently the government of Zimbabwe is funding perhaps over 90% of the infrastructure projects in Zimbabwe. What opportunity is there for the private sector to be involved in infrastructure development, and what are the barriers? Now I'm asking in terms of partnerships with the government, PPPs or PFIs. How can the private sector participate in infrastructure development in order for us to try and bridge the gap? Secondly, as a follow-up to that, what areas or what services are more amenable to private or public-private partnerships? We see that the government is doing a lot of road projects like the Harare-Bedbridge Road. If you were to look at it, I'm now comparing it with the need for clean water in Harare. Would the government, is it the best use of money for the government to do a roads project, which could be attractive to a private finance initiative? Or maybe the government should rather spend more money on projects such as water supply and wastewater projects, where which are low in terms of their attractiveness to private sector. Maybe you can answer that as a follow-up to my first question. Thank you. Thank you, Engineer Martin, for that. Yeah, perhaps maybe at some stage we would want to see how the government can attract even finance from its own citizens who are within and without the country, because we believe that Zimbabweans, as they come together, we will be able to start financing infrastructure projects in the country. So maybe that's another question that maybe needs to be addressed, and maybe the government can take some steps in attracting those kind of funds. So in terms of procurement, an effective procurement culture is key to delivering quality projects or value for money projects in any country. Now, the question that we are getting now is, what is the status of our procurement system, our general or overall procurement system in the country? What is it delivering? Are we getting quality projects out of it? Is it that which favors, for example, if it is a construction project, are we just getting the lowest tenderer and then giving them work? Or is our procurement system geared to achieve quality, from all aspects, of the works that we are trying to do? So maybe you can just tell us what, is there a procurement system that is working in Zimbabwe at the moment? Thank you, engineer. Yeah, it's high level. We keep our discussions a little bit high level. They say that an engineer is one who gets excited about things that no one else cares about. So we want to keep our discussions, to include or to entice everyone. Thank you for that response. I wanted to ask you. You worked at a project like Kariba Extension. That was a very prestigious project, and you have just spoken about the issue of skills transfer. On a project like this, did the local companies, was there any skills transfer at company level or even at individual level? What level of participation did we have on that kind of a project? And are there any lessons learned for other similar projects like that going forward in terms of local participation and skills transfer? Thank you, engineer. I'm sure there will be follow-up questions on a number of issues that we have already discussed. I'm going to ask you one of my last questions, and then I'll give Engineer Richard a chance to ask a couple of more questions. My question now is in terms of master planning. I see in Harare there seem to be a lot of haphazardness in terms of our development. Houses are being built everywhere now in green areas. Some of the areas where houses are going unfortunately, or they have been wetlands, which, as you know, they're very critical to the maintenance of our water sources. What is happening in Harare? Do we have a master plan? Is the master plan being followed? What is your assessment? And we have environmental agencies like EMA. What influence do those have in the approval of development permits and where things should go?
Thank you for giving me an opportunity, and I want to thank Engineer Manuhwa for such a great presentation. Just a few pointers to make in the presentation, which I've seen. Look, he's got vast wealth in terms of energy development and harnessing energy on its own, and thank you for that. My small contribution would actually towards going to the aspect of developing the engineering profession itself, to such an extent that, like what we do in South Africa, whenever infrastructure is being built, either a road, a bridge, or a mega building, it doesn't, we don't go to the close-out stage before engineers certify it and put in their extra professional numbers. I want to think that Zimbabwe, over 3-4 years ago, I think they've actually made the engineering profession as an act of parliament, which is protected by act of parliament, like our Act 41 of 2000 here, which protects engineering work. Look, I think Zimbabwe needs to gravitate towards that way, because in so many of the notions we discover that we find work being done, massive work being done, but probably the contractor and the owner will be owning the work. The project owner are the ones who are more decisive on the work. Here in South Africa, when it's a massive infrastructure project, engineers are more decisive on the work. We also need in Zimbabwe in some way, through you, Engineer Manuhwa, to be decisive when we go to an extent of doing some mega infrastructure projects. Recently, I was talking to my friend Doug concerning the Booth Junction cost, to say, where is the $89 million coming from? Fine, we know the cost of capital in Zimbabwe. That capital has to be sourced out somewhere else, and some correspondent banks, they refuse to partner Zimbabwe because of some other reasons. It's okay. But the value or the cost of our infrastructure at times is too bloated above the regional standards. Given a prerogative to comment on the Booth Junction, I can actually say the Booth Junction is probably about 4 times more expensive than its actual cost. So through Engineer Manuhwa and the people who are in Zimbabwe, we need to raise such concerns in order for us to be able to protect the national fiscus, the face of the national fiscus, and also in order for us to play a pivotal role, because some of these decisions and cost norms are decided by people who are non-technical and would contribute significantly in saving the national purse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Engineer Chivese and the rest of the team. It is a pleasure to be discussing infrastructure engineering and other developmental issues with you this evening. Thank you, Tom, for that very good question. In fact, the government's role in infrastructure must be clearly defined. The government stands up basically as a regulator, facilitating regulation in terms of how infrastructure is delivered. If the government now becomes both, in some instances, the regulator, the implementer of infrastructure problems, then it means there's quite a lot of work on the part of government. Elsewhere, I think some successful models of delivering infrastructure are such that there should be room through a policy framework, which we have, the Triple P policy framework, which invites the private sector to take part in the infrastructure development. But putting that policy alone and also putting all the regulatory requirements without making the conditions favorable for the private sector and capital to come and invest is another story. So basically what is needed is probably for government to go into much of the public infrastructure kind of sphere, things like schools, things like stadia, and some public general infrastructure, but attractive infrastructure like roads, even the delivery of water. I think the government should enhance its regulatory rigor to make sure that private players are finding an inroad into this. Look, take for instance, the city of Harare has been unable to supply water. I mean, this is the local government, to the northern suburbs and many other areas in Harare. But the private sector have haphazardly kicked in, by, people who doing water vending, and illegal boreholes, things that are not properly structured. But if we had a proper policy that would let private players go into this infrastructure requirements and needs, then we will be in a position to solve the water problem in Harare, which basically means now what the government basically needs is to ensure that the consumers are protected, the quality of the infrastructure is to the right standard. So I think there should be much business in business for government to be undertaking certain types of infrastructure, especially where the consumer is willing and able to pay. Roads can be told, and whoever comes in to invest can easily recoup their investment. Similarly, water and some of the other type of infrastructure, hospitality infrastructure, tourism infrastructure, and many other can finally finance themselves so that the fiscus or the PSIP funded projects are only those kind of social regulatory requirements that the government is required to do. So I agree with you that we should more enhance PFI funding, private funding initiatives, and this private should be in a triple P setup where the risks are well shared between the public, which is government, and also the private sector that brought the investment. The risk sharing and risk management is very, very important in triple Ps because capital is a coward. So what we basically need to ensure that we also are trusted by the private sector as government. For instance, one of the barriers that many of the private sector people feel is the currency distortions that come into play. Which currency are we using? The volatility and even the other economic factors like inflation and many other, besides the monetary instruments, can also dissuade some investors to come into the fray. But all the same, we need to ensure that we implement the joint venture unit, the triple P legislation, and also practice what we preach and make sure that the openness or Zimbabwe is open for business mantra is implemented to the spirit as espoused by His Excellency. Yeah, thank you very much. It's such a high level a question. I will attempt to discuss it. But before I do that, let me just generalize and start by putting on board the listeners just generally about infrastructure, what it is, how it can be clustered, and what is public infrastructure, what is social infrastructure, what is heavy infrastructure, and so on and so forth. I think infrastructure is the enabler for any livelihood in any community. It basically is composed of the enablements that we need to live in terms of transportation, energy, water, even dwellings, housing. For us to do commerce, you need infrastructure. So we cannot overemphasize infrastructure. And there is obviously social infrastructure as well, which basically is public infrastructure. And for Zimbabwe, we were privileged to have inherited the jewel of African infrastructure, which was intact at independence in 1980. But then it had its own advantage and disadvantages because it was then constructed with a certain philosophy in mind. It was the infrastructure that was world class, but only for a minority of the white citizens at that time and the privileged. So it was basically an infrastructure for 250,000, 250,000 whites were basically were privileged to be enjoying that infrastructure. Then came independence, where that world-class infrastructure had to be democratized. And indeed, there was quite a lot of concerted effort and policies of government at that time to ensure that some of the public infrastructure expands, but not at the rate at which we had democratized. For instance, you are all aware that there was suddenly a shortage of schools in terms of buildings because the schools were bottlenecked, and so on and so forth. And this also had its own challenges. Notwithstanding that, I think our infrastructure was world class. And for any infrastructure, it's not just good enough to have a world-class infrastructure. You must also have a maintenance, a mindset. This is why you need practitioners in the built environment. And in the built environment, these are the people who ideate, conceive, design, build, construct, and commission and then maintain and decommission the infrastructure. These are professionals in the built environment, which are engineering practitioners composed of engineers, technologists, technicians, artisans, craftsmen. Then we also have among the infrastructure practitioners, architects, we have quantity surveyors, we have many other built environment practitioners that are part of the project team. So what then went wrong with the Zimbabwean infrastructure system was that it did not expand at the same rate as the population and also as the democratization. So as a result, as the challenges, economic challenges hit Zimbabwe up to probably 1997, when we had our first fallout with the monetary, when the dollar actually, the Black Friday. This Black Friday also affected not only the social, economic lifestyle, but also the infrastructure, which anyway had been deteriorating and aging and not being maintained at the same rate. So I can say at the moment, Zimbabwe's infrastructure is mainly on the average or below average in terms of its maintainability, usability, condition, and also fit for purpose. So I think as we develop, we can simply say our infrastructure slid down to the fact that there were some studies and reports which think that for us to take back, again using a restoration mindset, our infrastructure to the 1997 level, we need 27 billion US dollars, which is quite a lot. But then the point is, do we want to restore or we want to meet the aspirations of Vision 2030? And again, in 2019, the African Development Bank posited that Zimbabwe needs to spend 3.3 billion annually till 2030 to meet the Vision 2030, which is that of an upper middle class economy by 2030. So this is where we are. We have huge gaps and deficit of infrastructure and not enough funding. Thank you. Thank you very much. There is indeed a PRAS Act, which is the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe Act, that calls for the procurement and disposal of assets in Zimbabwe. It is currently being amended. I think the executive have found it being very kind of an albatross around our neck because of sometimes increased bureaucracy and costs of projects, and also certain requirements for local content and local professional recruitment. So basically, yes, we have a Procurement Act which has devolved the powers of procurement to the state-owned enterprises through the procurement management units in each of those units. But that system, again, like I can tell you from a professional point of view, has got its own demerits and disadvantages. What we probably need as Zimbabwe is probably a procurement management regime that takes into cognizance quality procurement, especially for professional services, for consulting engineers. This should be not be procured through competitive bidding, but because they are well-known professionals who have done previous work, who can groom others through their associations and through their professional ethics, and as such, they can only compete on the quality of their work. As we had before the PRAS Act, a competitively priced procurement system in the infrastructure or built environment, where these professionals, especially consulting engineers, were procured on the quality and on their history and on their track record. So this way, I think we can then now lean on to the best practices internationally in procurement, such that the procurement units or the PMU should then look further as to procuring the best quality through an approach that looks at issues like the value engineering. Is it really properly priced in terms of the value for money? That should be number one in procurement. And also number two should be the quality and robustness of that solution. And number three, obviously, it should be the responsiveness to the client or owner's requirements, which basically means our procurement system should be so designed as to procure the best quality at the most competitive cost. And to do so, and once we open these floodgates of procurement, and because of the decade or so of inactivity, you may find certain experiences that are required by the procurement entities may not be favorable to Zimbabwean service providers. So we probably then need to find out that in our procurement system, where we do not categorize the complexity of the work, we should have quotas for local services or for local content or local practitioners and also local materials, which basically means, for instance, when we are building a power station, it's not all supposed to be 100% external consultants, because we believe we can also have an input of over 40%, no matter how complex that system is. So it then must be in a new regime of procurement system that then entails that whoever comes for high-level complex jobs from outside is supposed to transfer skills, transfer technology, and also transfer systems and transfer project management skills to the local consulting industry, such that as soon as they leave, we also need to build a capacity and a local footprint of professional services in Zimbabwe. So our current procurement system is very, very quiet, a little bit quiet on that. For it just speaks of local content without a prescription of the training, technology, and human resource skills transfer that is required. So I think the best practice is such that we need now to sit together to ensure that professional procurement is differentiated from services, from goods procurement, which of course that one can be competitive bidding, etc., and also the capacity of that. So we basically need to have these quotas for our local contractors, quotas for our local professional engineers, architects, and the built environment professionals in general. So I am saying there is room for improvement for our current procurement regime. We also need to ensure that we deal with corruption in the procurement stage, although corruption does occur throughout the cycle, the project life cycle of the whole project. But we must ensure that we put systems and standards and deterrence. One way is to ensure that government has a procurement, a PMU, a project a procurement and management unit that then does the procurement. And this must be internationalized in a sense that it must have global people, representatives from banks, representatives from the government itself, and representatives from funders, and also professional bodies like the ZIE, ZES, Architects Council, and people like that, so that it becomes a whole fair game, and then there's value for money, and corruption is nipped in the bud. I think it's a very difficult question, but I've tried my best to touch some of the key areas that we need to look at. Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. I think it's a very important question in a sense that whatever project we have done, we need to take lessons for the future so that we do not repeat whatever pitfalls we face in Project A, and we use those lessons learned in Project B, C, and D. Yes, skills transfer was one of the biggest objectives the client anticipated, but then it was not as structured. You know, with the Chinese EPC model, which is the engineering, procurement, and construction model, there is an assumption that they are bringing in the funding. And when they bring in the funding, they have a huge say as to who is on the project and who is not on the project. Indeed, there was a talk of a 10% quota to local contractors, but how to profile and measure that also is a problematic, as then there would not be a follow-up as to exactly whether we have a 10% local participation by the contractors. You know, there are simple things like supplying sand to the project, construction of certain buildings that should honestly have been, as you craft the contract or the EPC contract, which was the silver book, FIDIC. We should have anticipated and put these in black and white, so that we need a certain measure of local contractors, or Sinohydro, who was then the contractor contracting out the work there, which obviously was anticipated. But to a greater extent, there was a lot of skills imparted on the employees of the client, who then had to start a PMO, which is a project management office, with a site project manager and a team of section heads and employees, staff that were then going around the supervision and also the kind of capacity building for them to be able to be overseeing that kind of work. So to speak, we do have quite a pool of those that are on the project or were on the project or are still on the project that have got a bit of skills. But when we now go to the profiling of the skills that were being imparted, I've spoken about the employer, staff. I've spoken about the contractor, which was not quite visible, subcontractors. And then I'm speaking of the consulting engineer, where basically H and ZAIDG, our outfit, are the technical advisor. We're the technical advisor for that project. And I could easily say on there, we also would have wanted a bigger chunk in terms of skills and technology transfer, such as to have had more professional engineering companies working on the project and ensuring that even their participation was higher than they did contribute, especially on the Kariba project. So there is still room, and lessons learned are that we need to give a prescription during the procurement and contract stage of what technology we want transferred, and then profile, and then be able to measure at the end or mid-project or quarterly whether indeed there is true technology transfer, whether indeed there is true subcontracting, So the lessons learned is we really need to put instruments as a country to ensure that as we procure and negotiate these contracts, especially EPC contracts, we must prescribe the level of technology transfer we want. If we say 10% must be spent in training local staff, we must then measure whether 10% of the project cost has indeed, through certificates, been used for training the local staff. So there is a lot for not only that project and not only for Zimbabwe, but for the rest of Africa to learn when we are entering into EPC contract, that we must ensure that we must protect our local skills and ensure that we gain something and transfer skills so that those projects are not white elephants. If the contractors, say from China, Japan, or wherever they come from, go back to their country. So all these things must be put in writing, like the manuals must be in English, readable, and they must all be project designs done and approved by the consultant. All these technologies need to be transferred, and there should be boxes that should be ticked in any EPC project or in a huge and complex project of that nature. So in a way, I think there are a lot of lessons learned, and as a country, we should move on and ensure that the next EPC contracts we sign are properly structured and they are well dimensioned into as exactly what amount of technology transfer in the form of percentages or in the form of skills complexities we want transferred to our local workforce. Thank you. Yeah, okay. The issue of wetlands, master plans, infrastructure master plans, are really a worrying battle from the professional bodies for a long time. I remember during my time as the president of the Zimbabwe Institution of Engineering, that was in 20067, we did lead a delegation then to complain about certain construction that the sites that had been allocated and which were clearly on the map for the wetlands. And we did at that time, and many other predecessors and many professionals did highlight the dangers of a lack of development permits being offered to developers to build in wetlands, in very, very serious conservation areas. This to us indicates that the master plans, if they are available, they are on paper. If they are not, I think we now need to have an infrastructure bill. I know recently that takes serious action against any such offenders that are found, whether be they local authorities, be they developers, be they whoever they are, because the damage that we have done or are doing to wetlands will affect our rivers, will affect our livelihood. You can tell recently, even the flooding in Chitungwiza of late, and the drying up of certain rivers. I mean, there are so many examples that we can look at. So basically what I think is we basically need to take infrastructure development seriously and ensure that as recent, I remember cabinet coming up with very serious regulations against people that have been allocated or are building or violating wetlands regulations. But to me, that is not enough. I think what we probably need to do is to have an infrastructure bill that looks into how we conceptualize our infrastructure, how we design it, how we build it, how we fund it, how we operate and maintain it, and also how do we decommission it. This, to me, will be able enable Zimbabwe to meet its obligation in terms of infrastructure for the upper middle income economy by 2030, by also designing smart to ensure that our designs take care of climate action and mitigate against climate change. So we also need to make sure that our design codes are adaptive, which means adaptation in design and the resilience is very, very important. To me, this infrastructure bill will have everything infrastructure under one roof, including for ensuring that the developers have got a mindset that ensures that the infrastructure is green, the infrastructure is modern. We just don't want the restorative type of design, but also a design mindset that looks at modern techniques, modern technologies like BIM, also modern equipment that we now have in designing that are lowering the construction costs, the use of drones, the use of big data analytics for us to deal with the data in terms of wetlands and construction and many other data in engineering design, construction maintenance, and also project management. So this infrastructure bill, in my opinion, will ensure that we adopt the Industry 4.0 revolution techniques, which some people are now calling Construction 4.0, so that Zimbabwe can lower the cost of delivering its infrastructure, and Zimbabwe can also make sure that our commerce, our industries, our mines, our farms are supported with adequate, resilient, and fit for purpose infrastructure. Yeah, to Matthew and Leslie, you are basically asking about the soft skills that we should possess as professional engineers. One is language. For instance, yes, the language barrier with the Chinese, both spoken and written. Yeah, I think the electricity situation in the country is something that we really need to act on, both in terms of the triple P investment, or in electricity, we now call that IPP, which basically means the independent power producers are needed to work alongside the generator, that is the ZPC, to ensure that ZESA is also capacitated in terms of repowering its power stations, which have basically a life which needs a refurbishment after some time, normally 30 to 40 years, which basically means you need to ensure that you make sure you do your demand forecasting scenarios and ensure that you increase your generation to meet demand, which is not quite happening. So we really need to decide on the generation pathway, and I know ZESA has got a plan, a system development plan that uses some data as to which generation will come at what point in time. But normally these plans don't normally work according to plan. If you look at the system development plan, there are quite a lot of things that power stations that should have gone through in SADC and also in Zimbabwe, one of which is the Hwange stage 3, which is Hwange 7 and 8. And we pray as Zimbabwe that stage generator number 7 comes into play, like the client ZESA is promised, the energy state on the enterprise is promised that the first generator will be up by 2022, and then the second by 2020, early 2023. So we just hope this will go a long way to alleviate the power shortage that we have. But over and above that, we also need to ensure that ZESA deals with both their scenarios in terms of their policy demand forecast systems of which generation and how much they raise capex to ensure that they put new generation, including solar and renewable energy power systems like biogas into our system. So we envision that probably by 2025, we could have as much solar generation, wind. There is a lot of potential for wind at the right heights. And also I can tell the rest of the world for now, we can't stop using our coal. What we reuse, if the UK developed with their coal, all the way from and spoiled the ionosphere with the first, second, and third industrial revolutions, we can just mitigate the pollution that coal causes by using limestone and the BCG technologies and other filters to ensure that we are within the IFC and World Bank limit that EMA is prescribed in Zimbabwe. So we will probably encourage that our coal generation becomes smarter, but we continue with it, but also look at renewable energies and see exactly how we can then have new generation coming on board. We also hope by 2025, the Batoka project can kick off so that by 2025, 20 to 28, we have the commissioning of the Batoka project. And then also looking at 2027, there is also Mpandankua, which is another 600 megawatts committed by our neighbors, but also available for Zimbabwe. So this is a regional issue. We also must ensure that our energy mix must be between imports, hydro, and also solar PV as we go. And as we probably, hopefully, that there will be gas from Mozambique soon, we also hope to keep our eyes open so that we can have a safe energy mix that is composed of a safer energy balance, that we can also pray for a net zero emission by 2050. So it's very, very important as Zimbabwe to ensure that we can keep probably by 2030 a 25% generation mix of coal, maybe 27 to 30 hydro and gas, 19 to 20 if possible, PV solar 27 to 30%. And reduce imports because those do not have energy security and they are also costly. So we need to create these hydro generation scenarios. This is why we need diasporas. This is why we need all the professionals in energy to come together. And also there is this entity called ZESIT, which is the Zimbabwe Electricity or Energy Industry Supply Industry Trust, ZESIT. And this trust should work together with the Ministry of Energy, with the government of Zimbabwe, and ensure that it works with diaspora, greybeards, to bring them back to the country or work from wherever they are to ensure that we build our requisite generation. For energy, that's my specialty. I can talk all night. But what I'm simply saying is thank you very much. We need to be very patient and assist ZESA by paying our bills, as well as assisting with the ideas. And I'm sure the ZESA management is open to ideas. We can work with them from wherever we are, from the diaspora, and ensure that we have a proper energy mix through our installation capacity, through the 500 megawatts best case scenario needs diasporans to invest in solar plants, power plants, in solar farms, etc., etc. And again, we must make sure that we can work on our emissions so that we reduce them to reach probably megatons of maybe less than 13 or 15. And then as we approach our net zero in 2050. Thank you very much. I was saying to Leslie and Matthew, we need to have soft skills as professionals. language skills. For example, for the Romanian experience, I'm not familiar, but I am very familiar with the Chinese experience. We at one time had wanted to have our staff trained in Chinese, but then we realized that it was also a big risk because Chinese is very, very complex. And once instructions were now going to be given in Chinese, you would then have them having excuse of miscommunication. So on site, we have in the contract that all instructions should be given in English. And all written instructions should be in English and also approved by the client, in this case, which is the project owner. So once you have that enforced, that is very, very important. And language needs to be managed both in manuals. To Leslie, I say we need to have more technical people in policy. Most of you guys are shy to go into policy making. You keep your formulas and then you let the other professions decide for you. And they would have no clue about the nitty-gritties of engineering problems. Because as engineers, I know you have skills like wicked problem solving, where you are working comfortably in this VUCA vortex with nothing to worry about, because engineering is all about solutions. But that's not good enough if you are not on the table for policy making. So you must make sure that you have a reasonable representation in terms of some people in government, some people in the ministries, and also some people in the private sector, so that you can work as advisory services to your communities, to government, and to everybody else. You need to learn how to chart your way in the uncharted waters, and you must also have a mindset that is able to unlearn, relearn, and learn new things, new thinking, design thinking. Project management is very, very, very important in this unique environment we find ourselves in. So it is very, very important that we work together. And I'm sure the organizers on this platform will make us meet again to ponder on specific problems, so that once in a while we can also assist government, we can assist our municipalities. It's not a time for blame game anymore. We have to contribute as professionals. So just roll up your sleeves and offer yourselves and knock their doors very hard and say, we have come to help. We have got the skills. I am Kenny. I've built the 50 million pounds interchange at the M9, and I also want to work at the Mbunzi interchange. Please, can you open the door for me? That's the attitude. I thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope we'll have more time to chat again.